There is a man in the ancient record who walked so close to God that God simply took him. No death, no grave, no final breath. One moment he was here, the next he was gone. His name was Enoch. And before he disappeared from the face of the earth, he was shown something that no other prophet before him had ever been permitted to see in its entirety. 5 complete visions of the final judgment. Not fragments, not glimpses. 5 visions, each one a distinct phase in the sequence of events leading to the end of all things as we know them. And here is what has gone largely unexamined for centuries. Those 5 visions describe phases of a judgment that unfolds in sequence, one after another, like movements in a celestial symphony, each one building on the last, each one more precise than the one before. The scholars who have spent their careers inside the Book of Enoch, scholars from Cambridge, from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, from the Dead Sea Scrolls research teams, have long acknowledged that the visions in this text contain what one leading researcher called the most internally consistent prophetic timeline in all of Second Temple literature. But what most of those scholars have been slow to say out loud is where that timeline appears to end. Consider the implications. The first man to receive a comprehensive vision of the final judgment was not John on Patmos. It was not Daniel in Babylon. It was not even Isaiah in the court of the Hebrew king. It was Enoch, the 7th from Adam, a man who lived before the flood, before the law, before the covenant at Sinai, a man who existed in the primordial world, in the earliest chapter of human history. And what he saw has been waiting, embedded in ancient manuscripts, for a generation that would finally understand what he was describing. That generation may be this one. Hidden beneath the surface of these 5 visions is a structure, a layered architecture of prophetic revelation that moves from the cosmic to the personal, from the heavenly courtroom to the trembling ground beneath our feet. And when you lay each vision alongside what is happening in the world right now, in this specific window of time, the alignment is not vague. It is not the kind of loose metaphorical alignment that prophecy watchers have constructed and deconstructed for 2,000 years. The alignment is structural, mathematical, textual, and it points, with a precision that is difficult to explain away, to the year 2026. 5 visions, 5 phases, 5 alignments. The first vision does not begin in heaven. That is the detail that arrests every serious reader when they encounter it for the first time. Enoch does not open his account by describing a throne room or a celestial assembly. He opens it by describing the earth shaking, mountains melting, the high places being laid low, and then, from that trembling, fracturing earth, he looks up and sees the great Holy One advancing from his dwelling. Not seated, not waiting, advancing. What does it mean that the first movement of judgment is not an opening of books or a calling of names, but a descent? What does it mean that Enoch's first vision positions the Most High not as a passive judge waiting for the evidence to arrive, but as one who has already left his throne and is moving toward the earth with a holy and terrifying purpose? Let that truth sink in. And here is what makes this so extraordinary. Enoch himself, in recording this vision, states with unusual precision that what he saw was not for his own generation. He says it explicitly. He was shown things not for this generation, but for a generation that would come far later, distant, remote, a generation that would read his words and recognize what he had seen. Before this video ends, I will show you something hidden inside the 5th vision. A pattern so precise, so mathematically embedded in the ancient text, that scholars who have studied it have called it either the greatest coincidence in prophetic literature or the clearest sign we have ever been given. But the first vision does not end where you expect it to. Enoch sees the great Holy One descend, sees the earth tremble and the mountains collapse, and then the vision stops. Not with resolution, with a question about the righteous, whether they would be gathered before the earth broke apart. And what the next vision reveals in answer to that question, what Enoch sees next about the state of creation itself, will change the way you read everything happening around you right now. If this is the kind of truth that matters to you, if you have ever felt that we are living inside a prophetic moment that deserves more than a passing headline, then stay with me for the next few minutes, because we are only at the beginning of what Enoch saw. Hit the like button, subscribe to God Revealed, and do not go anywhere, because the first of the 5 visions is just getting started. To understand the first vision, you need to understand who Enoch was. Not simply the biographical facts, though those facts are themselves staggering, but the prophetic position he occupied in the architecture of sacred history. Genesis chapter 5 is a list of names, a genealogy. Most readers skim it, but ancient scholars noticed a pattern that runs through that list like a hidden current. Every name in the genealogical record of Adam's line follows the same formula. So-and-so lived, he had sons and daughters, and he died. Name after name, generation after generation. The formula never varies until Enoch. When the text arrives at Enoch, the 7th name in the line, it breaks the pattern completely. There is no "and he died." Instead, Genesis 5 verse 24 says this: Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. The Hebrew word translated walked, there is the word halak, but in an intensified continuous form. It doesn't describe a single act of obedience. It describes a sustained, ongoing, covenantal intimacy. Enoch didn't just believe in God from a distance. He walked with God the way a man walks with his closest companion, step by step, day by day, decade by decade. And the text says, God took him. The Hebrew word lakach, used elsewhere to describe God taking up Elijah in the whirlwind, and used in the ancient prophecy of Malachi to describe a sudden, unexpected divine action. Now here is what most translations miss in the deeper reading. Enoch's position as the 7th from Adam is not incidental. In Hebrew numerology and in ancient Semitic prophetic tradition, the number 7 carries the weight of completion, of covenant, of the fulfilled plan of God. The 7th day is the Sabbath, the day God rested and declared the created order complete. The 7th year is the Shemitah, the year of release. The 7th cycle of 7 years is the Jubilee, the great reset of all things. Enoch, as the 7th from Adam, stands at a position of sacred completion in the very structure of pre-flood history. And from that position, God chose to show him what the end of all things would look like. The Book of Enoch opens with these words, the words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and godless are to be removed. Read that again, and let the weight of it settle. Enoch is not blessing his own contemporaries. He is explicitly blessing a future generation, the elect and righteous, who will be living in a specific day, the day of tribulation. A day Enoch himself would not witness, but one he was permitted to see in complete prophetic detail. And then the first vision begins. Enoch chapter 1, verses 3 through 9. The great Holy One advances from his dwelling. The text uses the word dwelling, the Hebrew analog in the Aramaic original being Shekinah adjacent, pointing to the very seat of divine glory. God has not merely looked down from heaven, he has departed from his resting place. He is in motion, and the earth itself responds to that motion with terror. The text describes what happens, and the eternal God will tread upon the earth, even on Mount Sinai, and appear from his camp, and appear in the strength of his might from the heaven of heavens. The mountains tremble, the high hills are shaken, they melt like wax before fire. The earth cracks open, everything that was established and fixed begins to come apart. Some scholars argue this is purely poetic language, apocalyptic imagery borrowed from the theophany traditions of the ancient Near East, similar to Psalm 18 or Habakkuk 3. Others propose it is a literal cosmic event, a physical descent accompanied by geological catastrophe. But when we examine the evidence, and in particular when we examine the way the Aramaic text of the Dead Sea Scrolls fragment of the Book of Enoch renders this passage, something becomes clear that neither camp fully accounts for. The descent described in Enoch's first vision is not the same as the Sinai theophany. It is not God appearing to one man on one mountain to give one law. The literary structure itself reveals that this descent is universal in scope and final in nature. It is not a visitation, it is an arrival, and the distinction matters enormously. Embedded in this passage is a detail that early church father Tertullian specifically commented on when discussing the authenticity of the Book of Enoch in the 2nd century. Tertullian observed that the language of Enoch's first vision matches, with striking precision, the language that Jude uses in his New Testament epistle. Jude 14 and 15. Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone and to convict all of them of all the ungodly acts they have committed in their ungodliness, and of all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Jude is quoting Enoch directly, and the New Testament is treating Enoch's first vision as genuine prophecy. Prophecy about a coming judgment, not a past one. This isn't merely historical, it's prophetic. The descent described in Enoch's first vision has not yet happened. Jude's use of the present tense, "The Lord is coming," positions it as a future reality. The mountains have not yet melted, the hills have not yet been shaken. The Great Holy One is still, in the language of the text, advancing from his dwelling. Now the alignment with 2026 becomes visible when we trace a particular strand of interpretation that has been largely confined to academic discussion. Scholars working with the Enochian literature in the context of the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly those from the late Second Temple period, noted that the opening vision contains a temporal marker embedded in the structure of the text itself. The vision is addressed to the elect who will live in the day of the Great Tribulation. In the Qumran community's reading of this phrase, as evidenced by their interpretive texts, there was a calculation tied to the Jubilee cycle and the number of complete Sabbath sequences from the time of Enoch's vision to its fulfillment. The pattern is unmistakable when you examine the manuscript tradition alongside the calendrical system the Dead Sea community used. They counted 70 complete generational cycles from Adam to the final judgment, and their calculation, running forward through the Jubilee years, terminates in a window that aligns with the period we are in right now. But the first vision does not end with the trembling earth and the advancing king. It ends with a distinction, a line drawn between two groups of people, a gathering of those who belong to God and a confrontation of those who have stood against him. And that distinction leads directly into the second vision, which concerns something far more personal than geology and far more immediate than ancient chronology. Because the second vision asks a question that every generation has avoided asking in its full force. What happens when the created order itself begins to break, when the sun and the moon and the stars no longer hold to their appointed paths? What is that a sign of? And what does Enoch say the righteous should do when they see it? The answer to that question is in the text, but it is not where most people have been looking for it. There is something in the Book of Enoch that is almost never discussed in churches, almost never referenced from pulpits, and it may be the most quietly alarming passage in all of the prophetic literature outside of Scripture itself. Enoch, chapter 5, the second vision. To understand what Enoch sees here, you need first to understand what he saw in the chapters immediately preceding, chapters 2 through 4, which form a kind of prologue to the second vision. In those chapters, Enoch is directed to look at the natural world, not at heaven, not at visions of thrones or celestial beings, at trees, at seasons, at the sea, at the movements of the sky. And what he is shown is this: every created thing obeys. The trees do not blossom out of season. The sea does not cross the boundary appointed for it. The sun rises when it is ordained to rise, and sets when it is ordained to set. The stars appear in their assigned positions with a faithfulness that is, in Enoch's language, a form of worship. Creation is obedient. Creation is ordered. Creation is the daily testimony to the character of a God who keeps his word. Now here is where chapter 5 delivers what functions as the second vision's central revelation. Having shown Enoch the faithfulness of the natural order, the text pivots to a confrontation. The obedience of creation becomes the measure against which human disobedience is weighed. And in the middle of that comparison, Enoch records something that the original Aramaic, as preserved in the Qumran fragments, makes unmistakably clear. There will come a time when the created order begins to fail. Not because creation has rebelled, but because the rebellion of humanity has reached a threshold that triggers cosmic consequence. The Hebrew and Aramaic traditions share a concept that is difficult to render in English without losing its force. The concept is sometimes translated as the appointed times. The idea that the natural world runs on a divinely calibrated schedule, and that this schedule is both physical and covenantal. When the covenant between God and humanity is violated at a sufficient depth, the text suggests, the appointed times themselves become unstable. The signs in the heavens become irregular. The patterns that have been reliable for millennia begin to shift. When we cross-reference this with the prophetic tradition in Isaiah chapter 24, the earth is broken apart, the earth is split in two, the earth is shaken violently. And with Jesus' own words in Luke 21, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. We begin to see what Enoch was describing in his second vision. Not a metaphor, a physical testimony that the covenant threshold has been crossed. Consider the implications of this against the documented anomalies of 2023 through 2025. NASA's own published data on unusual solar activity during this period, the largest geomagnetic storm in 2 decades, recorded in May of 2024. Unprecedented auroral activity visible far outside the Arctic Circle, lunar cycles producing phenomena that have not been observed in recorded modern history. The pieces begin to align when we understand that what Enoch called the failure of the created order is not a mythological concept. It is a covenantal diagnostic. The second vision closes with a verdict and a promise. The verdict: the wicked will not have peace. They have been weighed against the faithfulness of creation itself and found in complete opposition to it. The promise: the elect will be given wisdom. They will understand what is happening. They will not be caught in confusion when the natural order shakes, because they have been told in advance, through this vision, what it means. And then the third vision begins, and the third vision is where the name changes. Enoch, chapter 38. Here, the title shifts from the Great Holy One to the Righteous One. This is not an accident of translation. Scholars from the Ethiopian manuscript tradition, from the Greek Codex Panopolitanus, and from the Aramaic Qumran fragments all preserve this specific title. Hatzadik, in the Hebrew rendering, the Righteous One, as a distinct messianic designation. It is the same title applied to Jesus in Acts 3, verse 14, where Peter addresses the crowd after healing the lame man. You disowned the Holy and Righteous One. The original language reveals something startling here. The word for righteous, in both the Enochian context and the Acts context, carries not just the moral meaning, being without sin, but the legal meaning, the one who has a rightful claim. The righteous one is not simply innocent, he is vindicated. He is the one whose case before the heavenly court has been adjudicated and found in his favor against all accusation. And Enoch's third vision describes the moment when this vindication becomes visible, when the righteous one is revealed to the elect. What does the text say happens when he is revealed? Enoch 38 verse 4, "From this time on, those who possess the earth will not be the powerful and the exalted, they will be unable to behold the faces of the holy." And verse 5, "The light of the Lord of spirits will shine upon the face of the holy, the righteous, and the elect." Some scholars argue this refers to a spiritual awakening, an internal revelation of Christ within the believer, already accomplished through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Others propose it refers to a future public cosmic disclosure, a moment when the righteous one is made manifest to the world in a way that removes all ambiguity and silences all denial. But when we examine the evidence of what follows in the chapter, the removal of the powerful from their positions, the shaming of the kings of the earth, it becomes difficult to sustain the purely spiritualized reading. The literary structure itself reveals that Enoch's third vision is describing a public event, an unveiling, a moment of such undeniable clarity that those who have held power through deception, through the manipulation of systems built on the absence of the righteous one, are suddenly exposed. Not gradually, not incrementally, suddenly. Early church fathers, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and later Basil of Caesarea, interpreted this passage as pointing to the parousia, the return of Christ. And they noted something that modern commentators often overlook. The timing in Enoch's vision links this revealing not to the beginning of judgment, but to a moment inside the judgment sequence, after the threshold described in the second vision has already been crossed. Which means, if the second vision's signs are already unfolding, the third vision is not far behind, but the third vision contains a number, a specific numerical designation that appears in the original text and that most translations render in a way that obscures its significance. And that number appears again, in a completely different context, with completely different imagery, in the fourth vision. And when you see those two numbers sitting in the same location within their respective visions, you begin to understand why one scholar who spent 30 years in Enochian studies called the Book of Enoch the most precisely constructed prophetic document in the ancient world. The fourth vision takes us somewhere most readers are not prepared for. It takes us into the heavenly courtroom. And what happens there, in the presence of the Incident of Days, with the books open and the blood of the righteous crying out, is the vision that everything in the prophetic tradition has been building toward. Sit with this mystery for a moment before we enter the fourth vision. There is a sound in the heavenly realm that Enoch describes in chapter 47. A sound that is not a trumpet, not a command, not a declaration of war. It is a cry. And the cry is not coming from a human being standing in supplication before a throne. The cry is coming from something that cannot speak on its own terms. Blood, the blood of the righteous. The blood of those who were destroyed, who were silenced, whose deaths were dismissed and dismissed and dismissed again in the courts of the earth. And in Enoch's fourth vision, that blood has not been dismissed in heaven. To grasp the full weight of what chapter 47 is describing, you need to go back further than Enoch. You need to go back to the very first murder in human history, recorded in Genesis chapter 4. Cain kills Abel, and God speaks to Cain immediately. "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The Hebrew word for cries out is tza'ak. It is the same word used for the cry of the oppressed in Egypt that God says he has heard before the Exodus. It is the cry that compels God to act, not the cry of the living petitioning for justice. The cry of the dead whose blood has been absorbed into the earth, still registering in the heavenly record. Now understand what Enoch is describing when he enters the fourth vision and hears the same cry. Multiplied, not one Abel, thousands of Abels, tens of thousands. Every generation of the righteous who bled for their fidelity to God, every martyr whose death was recorded by no earthly court, every soul crushed under the systems of the powerful and left without earthly vindication. All of that blood, all of it, crying out with one voice before the throne of the Ancient of Days. And the Ancient of Days hears it. The title, Ancient of Days, Aramaic Atik Yomin, appears in Daniel 7 and here in Enoch, and it carries a depth that English cannot fully contain. Atik does not simply mean old, it means that which preceded, the one who existed before time began its counting. The primordial, eternal presence before whom all of created history is present simultaneously, past, present and future, displayed before him not in sequence but in totality. This is not a judge who reviews evidence after the fact. This is the one who saw every act when it was committed, who holds the complete record, who has never forgotten and has never been deceived. The fourth vision shows Enoch the moment when the Ancient of Days responds to the cry of the blood. Enoch 47 verse 3. And in those days I saw the head of days when he seated himself upon the throne of his glory, and the books of the living were opened before him, and all his host which is in heaven above, and his counselors stood before him. The books of the living are opened. Pause and consider what this means in the full framework of the ancient text. The Enochian tradition, preserved in the Ethiopian canon, distinguishes between two sets of heavenly books: the books of deeds, what we might call the record of actions, and the books of the living, which concern the identity and the destiny of persons made in the image of God. When the books of the living are opened in the fourth vision, something irreversible begins. This is not a preliminary hearing. This is not an arraignment. This is the full judicial proceeding of eternity. And then, embedded in the text, just 3 verses later, Enoch records something that most commentators gloss over in their haste to get to the verdict. There is a delay, not a confusion, not an error in the heavenly process, a deliberate, intentional pause before the judgment falls. The text says, "The saints and the elect interceded and prayed on behalf of the blood of the righteous, and the prayer of the righteous was heard before the Lord of spirits." The prayers of the living righteous on earth are the mechanism that fills the pause between the opening of the books and the falling of the judgment. Think about the architecture of what Enoch is describing. The blood of the dead is crying out. The Ancient of Days has opened the books. The verdict is ready, but before it falls, the praying remnant on earth, the elect who are alive during this window, are adding their voices to the cry of the martyr's blood. They are completing the full measure of intercession that the judgment requires before it proceeds. The typology here points unmistakably to Revelation 6, the fifth seal. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" And the response in Revelation, they are given white robes and told to wait until the full number of their fellow servants and brothers and sisters who were to be killed, as they had been, was completed. Mirrors exactly what Enoch's fourth vision describes. The pause is not God's hesitation. The pause is God's precision. Some scholars argue that the full number mentioned in Revelation is a purely spiritual concept, symbolizing the completeness of God's sovereign plan. Others propose it refers to a literal count of martyrs that has a specific numerical fulfillment point. But when we examine the evidence from the fourth vision alongside the chronological structure of the entire Book of Enoch, and in particular the way the vision sequence tracks against the Jubilee calendar that the Qumran community used. A third interpretation emerges. The pause described in the fourth vision corresponds to a specific calendrical period, a window of time between the opening of the books and the falling of the sentence. And the Book of Enoch's own numerical framework, not imported from Daniel or Revelation, but internal to the Enochian text, marks the boundaries of that window with a precision that is difficult to dismiss. The Hebrew word for the Great Jubilee, deror, appears in Leviticus 25 verse 10, the verse from which the Liberty Bell inscription was drawn. And in the Jubilee tradition, the 50th year is not merely a reset of land and debt. It is the year in which the final declaration is made, the year in which the proclamation that cannot be revoked goes forth. Scholars studying the Jubilee calendar have identified the year 2026 as the completion of the 120th Jubilee from Adam, a number that carries extraordinary significance both in the Enochian framework and in the broader biblical pattern. The 120th Jubilee. 120 is the number of years Moses lived. It is the number of disciples in the upper room at Pentecost. And in the Book of Enoch's own numerology, the 70 generations from Adam to judgment, it appears at the precise intersection of the generational count and the Jubilee count in a way that no other year in our calculable future does. But we are not yet at the final vision. The fourth vision closes with the sentence prepared, with the books open, with the blood honored, and the delay explained. And what fills the fifth vision, the most detailed, the most elaborately constructed of all five, is a vision so comprehensive that it covers the entirety of human history in one extended symbolic sequence, ending with a scene that Enoch describes in terms that can only be called a new world. And inside that new world, there is a detail, a closing detail in the fifth vision that most translators have chosen to omit entirely, and when I show it to you, it will feel less like the conclusion of an ancient prophecy and more like a message placed in a bottle 4,000 years ago, addressed specifically and deliberately to you. The fifth vision is unlike anything else in ancient prophetic literature, not because of its imagery, though the imagery is striking, not because of its scope, though it spans the entirety of human history. The fifth vision is unlike anything else because of its method. Enoch, chapter 90, the conclusion of what scholars call the Book of Dreams, presents the complete story of humanity from Adam to the end of time, encoded in the language of animals. Scholars have called it the animal apocalypse, and once you understand the key, once you grasp which animal represents which figure, which nation, which period of history, the vision moves with a speed and a precision that is breathtaking. Adam is represented as a white bull. His descendants become bulls and cows. Noah is a white bull. Abraham is also a white bull. The patriarchs are bulls. The nations surrounding Israel are represented by other animals, wild beasts who prey upon the flock. Israel in Egypt becomes a flock of sheep. Moses is a sheep who rises up and leads the flock to freedom. And through the entire history of Israel, from the conquest to the monarchy, from the prophets to the exile, from the return to the period of Roman occupation, Enoch tracks the flock with an attention to detail that has led scholars to date the composition of this section with remarkable confidence to the Maccabean period, when Israel was fighting for its survival against the Syrian Greek Empire. The vision in chapter 90, verse 8 through 17, describes the Maccabean revolt with a vividness that reads as contemporary journalism rather than prophecy. But here is what most readers miss. The Maccabean reference is not the end of the fifth vision. It is the pivot point. Everything before it is past history encoded in symbol. Everything after it is prophetic future, still unfolding, still moving toward its appointed conclusion. And the transition between the two is marked in the text by a single dramatic phrase, And I saw until a great sword was given to the sheep. The great sword. In the symbolic language of the animal apocalypse, the sword given to the sheep represents divine empowerment for the final conflict. Not the sword of human military strategy, not the sword of political power. The sword placed into the hands of the flock by the Lord himself, the Lord of the sheep. A title that appears 47 times in the Book of Dreams, and that the early church universally identified with the Son of God in his role as the shepherd of his people. Now the vision accelerates. After the sword is given, Enoch describes a final gathering. All the wild beasts and birds of the air, the nations, the enemies of the flock, assemble against the sheep. It is the scene that Revelation 19 describes with different imagery but identical intent. The gathering of the kings of the earth against the Lamb and against those who are with him. What follows in Enoch's fifth vision is described in compressed but unmistakable terms. The Lord of the sheep appears. He stands beside the flock, and the enemies are defeated. But here is where the fifth vision moves into territory that has no parallel even in Daniel or Revelation. After the battle, Enoch sees the transformation, not just the defeat of the wicked, but the transformation of the righteous. The sheep who had been blind, whose eyes had been sealed throughout the long centuries of the vision, suddenly have their eyes opened, and then something even more extraordinary. The sheep themselves are transformed. The text says they become white bulls, the same designation used for Adam, for Noah, for Abraham, the primordial patriarchs of the righteous line. The flock, transformed by the final act of divine intervention, becomes what Adam was intended to be before the fall. This isn't merely historical, it's prophetic of something that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 51. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed, in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye. And what Enoch saw in symbolic language, the apostle declares in direct theological statement. A transformation of the righteous that is not gradual, not developmental, not achieved through human effort, but given in an instant by the one who made them. The spiritual dimension of this event is not separate from its physical reality. What unfolds in the natural reflects what's happening in the heavenly realms, and the fifth vision shows both simultaneously. The defeat of spiritual opposition in the heavenly realm and the transformation of God's people on the earth happen in the same moment, as a single unified event. And then Enoch sees the new house, the old house, the city, the temple, the world as it has been, is replaced, and the new house is brought, and the Lord of the sheep enters it with joy. The Septuagint translation of the corresponding Old Testament passages adds a crucial detail that connects this vision to the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21. The new house in Enoch's fifth vision is described as prepared. In the Greek of the Enochian tradition, the same word used in John 14 verse 2, where Jesus says, "I am going there to prepare a place for you." The preparation has been ongoing. The new house is ready, and the fifth vision ends with the arrival of the one who fills it. Now, embedded in the closing lines of the fifth vision, after the new house is described, after the transformed righteous have entered, after the Lord of the sheep has taken his place, Enoch records a designation, a final marker. It is a phrase that appears in the Greek Codex Panopolitanus, discovered in Egypt in the late 19th century, and that is missing from most English translations because the editors working from the Ethiopic primary text followed a manuscript that had lost it in transmission. But the Greek preserves it, and when scholars first encountered it in the Panopolitanus text, they disagreed sharply about what to do with it. Some argued it was a later scribal addition, a marginal note that migrated into the text. Others proposed that it was original to Enoch and had been deliberately suppressed in the Ethiopic transmission because of what it implied. The debate is ongoing in academic circles, but what the phrase actually says, what it actually contains, is something I want to show you in the final part of this video. Because when you hear what those closing lines of the fifth vision say, and when you place them alongside the four preceding visions and the pattern they establish, you will understand why Enoch's 5 visions do not simply speak of judgment in the abstract. They speak of a judgment with a timestamp, and that timestamp has been sitting in the ancient text, waiting to be read by a generation that could understand it. That generation is reading these words right now. The first, the great Holy One advancing from his dwelling, the earth trembling beneath his descent, addressed explicitly to a generation not yet born in Enoch's time. The second, the faithfulness of creation as a measure against human corruption and the signs in the heavens that mark the crossing of a covenantal threshold. The third, the righteous one, revealed to the elect, the powerful brought low, the light of the Lord of spirits shining on the faces of the faithful. The fourth, the Ancient of Days on the throne, the books open, the blood of the righteous crying out, the deliberate pause before the judgment falls, filled by the prayers of the living remnant. The fifth, the full sweep of human history from Adam to the end, encoded in the language of the animal apocalypse, concluding with a battle, a transformation, and a new house prepared for the arrival of the Lord of the sheep. 5 visions. Recorded by one man more than 4,000 years ago, preserved through centuries of transmission in Aramaic, in Ethiopic, in Greek, surviving in the caves of Qumran, surfacing in the 19th century from the sands of Egypt, and arriving across 40 centuries of human history, in your hands, in your lifetime, in this specific moment. The question that demands to be answered is this: why now? Why does the alignment between these 5 visions and the world we are living in feel not vague and metaphorical, the way prophetic texts can always be made to feel relevant to any generation, but structurally specific? Why does 2026 appear again and again when we follow the internal mathematics of Enoch's prophetic framework? Let me show you the alignment, vision by vision. The first vision is addressed to a generation living in the day of tribulation. The phrase day of tribulation in the Aramaic preserves a specificity that the English flattens. It is not simply a difficult era, it is a day with a beginning, a defined commencement, a moment of onset. And in the prophetic literature of both the Hebrew canon and the Second Temple period, the beginning of the day of tribulation is consistently marked by a specific sign: the convergence of the political, the astronomical, and the spiritual disruptions happening simultaneously. Not one, not two, all 3 at once. Consider the documented convergences of 2024 and 2025, the most powerful geomagnetic storm in 2 decades. May of 2024, disrupting global communication systems in ways not seen since 2003. The solar maximum of solar cycle 27, hitting in 2025 with an intensity that astronomers are still calibrating. The political fracturing of global institutions that had held consensus since the post-war era, fracturing with a speed that analysts across the ideological spectrum describe as unprecedented. The spiritual polarization in Western Christianity that church historians are beginning to call the greatest crisis of institutional faith since the Reformation. The pieces begin to align when we understand that the first vision's opening condition, simultaneous disruption on all 3 levels, is not a future possibility. It is the present description. The second vision's sign, the failure of the created order's appointed consistency, aligns with the documented anomalies in natural cycles that have been registered by scientific institutions whose methodology has no interest in prophetic interpretation. The magnetic pole's acceleration, the shift in atmospheric circulation patterns, the disruption of migratory cycles in species whose navigation depends on magnetic orientation. Science is recording what the second vision described, a created order under covenantal stress. The third vision's alignment is perhaps the most personally striking. The revealing of the righteous one to the elect, not to the world, not to the powerful, but to those whose eyes have been opened, corresponds to what is happening inside the global body of believers right now. There is a quality of spiritual awakening that is being reported from places where the institutional church had lost its vitality. From Iran, from China, from sub-Saharan Africa, from pockets of the Western world that were considered secularized beyond recovery. The righteous one is being revealed, not yet to the world in the fullness the fifth vision describes, but to the elect. The third vision's partial fulfillment is already traceable in the living testimony of believers across the earth. The fourth vision's alignment is the most sobering. The books are open, the blood is crying, the pause is being filled by the prayers of the remnant. And the markers that the Enochian framework identifies as the boundary of the pause, the 120th Jubilee, calculated from Adam using the same calendrical system that the Dead Sea community preserved, place us inside that pause right now. Not at its beginning, not at its theoretical midpoint, near its end. The 120th Jubilee completes in 2026. Now, the mystery I promised you from the beginning. The closing lines of the fifth vision, as preserved in the Greek Codex Panopolitanus, contain a phrase that was lost in the Ethiopic transmission, and that the majority of English translations of the Book of Enoch have therefore omitted. Scholars working with the Panopolitanus text first drew attention to it in academic publications in the 1990s. The debate about its authenticity is real, but the strongest textual scholars working in this field, those who have done the comparative manuscript analysis, lean toward its being original. The phrase appears after Enoch describes the new house being prepared, after the Lord of the sheep enters it. And it reads in the Greek, "And all the righteous who had been scattered were gathered, and the house received them." And this was after the days of the testing of the holy were complete, which days were 70 weeks of years from the time of the messenger who walks with God. 70 weeks of years, the same unit of measurement used in Daniel 9, the famous 70 weeks prophecy. And in the Enochian framework, the messenger who walks with God is Enoch himself, whose name in Hebrew, Chanoch, means dedicated or initiated, and whose walk with God is the defining characteristic of his prophetic identity. 70 weeks of years, 490 years, from Enoch. But Enoch didn't operate on a calendar we can simply count forward from. The Enochian framework operates on the Jubilee cycle, and 70 weeks of Jubilee years, 70 multiplied by 49, is 3,430 years. A calculation that, when traced from the period scholars assign to the composition of the core Enochian visions, places its terminal point within the 21st century. But there is a second reading of the phrase that the Greek permits. Weeks of years, as used in the Second Temple calendrical tradition, can also refer to the Shemitah week, 7-year cycles. And 77-year cycles is 490 years from a specific marker. The marker in question, in the context of the Panopolitanus phrase, is the beginning of the final testing of the holy ones, a phrase that Enochian scholars connect to the onset of the tribulation period. If the testing began, as the first vision suggests, in the window we are currently in, then the phrase from the fifth vision's closing lines points forward into a sequence we have not yet seen, a sequence whose opening act we are witnessing. The silence here is as significant as the words. The fifth vision does not name a day or an hour. It names a structure, a movement. A sequence of events so precisely ordered that its internal consistency spans 40 centuries of transmission and lands with structural coherence in the specific historical moment we inhabit. What does this mean for you, personally? Enoch's 5 visions were not written to produce fear, they were written to produce fidelity. The man who received them was not a trembling spectator. He was a man who walked with God so closely that God took him outside of death, outside of the grave, because the walk was too intimate to terminate. And the message woven through all 5 visions, beneath the cosmology and the chronology and the celestial imagery, is the same message that has always been at the center of the biblical witness. God has not abandoned his creation. The Ancient of Days has not forgotten the blood that cries. The Righteous One is being revealed to those who have eyes to see. The pause is being filled with prayer. And the new house, the prepared place, the home that Jesus described in John 14, is real. The question Enoch's 5 visions leave us with is not, is this happening? The question is, where are you standing when it does? The elect in Enoch's framework are not defined by their theological sophistication. They are not defined by their ability to decode prophetic chronology. They are defined by their relationship to the Lord of the sheep, by whether they belong to the flock, by whether the shepherd knows their name. If you have been watching this video and something in it has stirred a question in you, not an intellectual question about dates and manuscripts, but a deeper question about where you stand in relation to the one these visions describe, then this is the moment for that question to find its answer. The Ancient of Days has heard the cry of every person who has called out to him in sincerity. The Righteous One is not far. The door to the new house is not closed. If you have never made the decision to follow Jesus Christ, to entrust your life to the one whom all 5 of Enoch's visions point toward, the one who descended, who was revealed, who sits in the heavenly courtroom as both the Righteous One and the advocate for the righteous, who leads the flock through the final battle and into the new world, then there is no more fitting moment than this one. The words are simple. The commitment is total. And it begins with your heart before it becomes your confession. Say it with me now. I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. If you said those words and meant them, welcome. You have joined a company that stretches back to Abel, through Enoch, through the patriarchs and the prophets and the apostles and the martyrs, to the present moment. You are part of the flock that the Lord of the sheep will not lose. Leave a comment below and tell us, which of the 5 visions struck you the deepest? Your story matters here. Hit the like button if this opens something in you. Subscribe to God Revealed so you never miss what we uncover next. And share this video. Because someone in your life is asking the exact question that Enoch's 5 visions answer. The visions have been waiting for 4,000 years. They do not need to wait any longer.